I didn't see. Now everyone can hear me and my.
Anna Faye, what are we going to sing to begin with? Lord of the Dance. Number 261, if you need the music. Welcome. Welcome, everybody, and to those who are watching us online, also a special word of welcome. We have been looking at different denominations, primarily the United Church of Christ, which we did spend 6 weeks on. Last week, we looked at the Lutherans, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and one more, but I forgot who they were.
American Baptist.
American Baptist, yes, thank you. And I held off on this because I knew we'd have two guests with us tonight. For the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. My mom's side of the family were Disciples of Christ in Hunter, America, and some of them still are. Paul Culkin also was a disciples pastor before he married Jenny, or did you switch first before you married?
I switched a long time before.
It was not Jenny's cause.
No,
she was not the cause of it, so he switched a long time before that.
Only the beneficiary.
And also Shannon Fleck, who is ordained in the Disciples congregation. She is currently the director of the Oklahoma Conference of Churches. So before we begin, let me just also say some things I've been saying, but I know they're worth repeating. The members of Mosaic will be the ones to decide if they want to leave the United Methodist Church. It will not be a decision made by me or any of the staff. It will not be a decision made by the council or any committee. You will be alerted to when that discussion will be taking place. And there may be more than one discussion leading up to a vote. my intention would be that until we really know if General Conference is going to meet next year or not, there's nothing for us really to do unless someone just says, well, let's vote now. And so far, no one has said that, and if we decide to leave, if we wait till next year to really have that vote, we'll still have plenty of time to leave under the current rules, which would allow us to keep any of our property without any huge to-do about that, because prior to 2019, it was more difficult to leave, especially with your property. But in 2019, they made it a little bit easier to leave with the property, but that window closes at the end of 2023. So my guess is that next spring we will have a church-wide meeting after we hear about the plans of General Conference. And there'll be plenty of time for us to discuss any issues we want to discuss or explore anything we want to explore. There's actually a couple of votes we would have to take. One would be if we want to leave. And if we do leave, a separate discussion would be then, how do we want to affiliate with another denomination, or do we want to do that? Now, many of you have shared with me your thoughts on that. Some of you have not, and that's fine. And I've been very open about sharing my thoughts about that with you as well. And I want to say that for some people, this might be a very easy decision, and that's perfectly acceptable. And for some of us, it's a little bit more harder to think about this, especially if we were raised in the church, specifically the United Methodist Church, or if we have multiple generations in our family, of course, that are in the church. That makes it more difficult. And so we just have to acknowledge that and put that out there. What I handed out tonight is what you got last week. So if you were here last week, you've already received it. At the back are some sheets that may not be back there. I have some extra sheets from last week also, with the same kind of pages about the Lutherans, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and the American Baptists. But tonight we're focusing on the disciples. So if you look at that sheet, I'll just go over this very briefly, and then we'll open it up to any questions you might have or comments from Paul or Shannon. These were things that I found either online, and they seem to jive with what I knew from church history. So if I'm wrong about any of this, someone, I'm sure, will tell me. Some of the roots in the disciples are from Presbyterians and Methodists, maybe others, that were perhaps dissatisfied with the way churches were going and felt like they wanted to return to the principles of the New Testament church. Out of this movement started this movement called the Christian Church, which eventually, I think, kind of broke into three major groups: the disciples that we're talking about. Then there were the churches of Christ, who tend not to use instruments, and they trace their history also back to this movement. And then what's called the Christian churches, I call them a lot of times independent Christian churches.
Right.
They are loosely kind of organized together, but they're much less a denomination than any other group. And the two that I'm most well aware of are in Kentucky. There's a very large one in Lexington and also a very large one in Louisville. I think we have some in Oklahoma, but I just don't know of any of the biggest ones that we would know by name, right? They would be more conservative siblings to the disciples. They say when it comes to creeds, we have no creed but Christ. On baptism, they would say people should be old enough to make that decision for themselves, and they emphasize immersion. Their form of government, congregational. I think I've made the assumption that the local church owns the property, and you guys can fill us in on that tonight. As I understand it, there is no necessarily affirming LGBTQ statement on a denominational-wide scale, but that they would say they leave it up to the local churches. Now, I could be wrong on that, because sometimes news happens that doesn't...
You are wrong on that.
Do I?
You are wrong.
I am wrong. Okay, so you can fill us in on that tonight. All right. And what I was going to say is sometimes...
Which is fine.
Sometimes churches do things that don't make it into the news.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
And it's harder to find them on Google. And so that's why I said I might be wrong about that.
You're good.
When it comes to worship, there's lots of freedom, although they do probably have a pattern that a lot of them share. They also celebrate the Lord's Supper weekly. What I have on here, the rest of this, most of this came straight from Wikipedia because it was harder to find good chunks of information on the website, whereas the other churches really had more about me statements that I could just kind of copy and paste. But when it came to the disciples, I sort of took a lot of this. I read it, and I thought, this sounds like 90% true. So,
Also very typical of disciples.
Yes.
To not have a lot of about us stuff out there. We can get into that.
all right. So
Sorry.
I will say this, that when it comes to the UCC, I did Google and looked on Amazon for whatever books were out there. And I looked on their bookstore websites and whatnot. And as far as a book about, here's what we believe, I didn't find one, although when Lisa Wolf was here, she gave me a book that she said, this is sort of the standard book about what somebody wrote that they say this is kind of what, they wrote it based on their statement of faith, which of course is not a creed that they impose on churches or people. And the book itself said, this is my interpretation of this statement of faith. But Lisa was surprised that I had not seen it or that it had not been a book that we had read in my class I took online, but it was an older book, okay? There are maybe more than one, but I did find at least one book. I did find one book on Amazon about the disciples, and it was also fairly older, but like I've said, you can find dozens and dozens and dozens of books on John Wesley and what Methodists believe. It's almost like everyone's in a race to put out a new book. So I'll go ahead and just, do you guys want to say anything in response to what I've said, and then we can open it up to questions, or do you have any statements you want to make in general, or Paul, do you want to start?
Well, sure. Probably having grown up in disciples, well, I grew up in a disciples congregation in Northeast Arkansas, and it was on the spectrum a fairly progressive congregation. I did not know that. My first exposure to much more conservative points of view was when I was in high school and the Disciples of Christ in Arkansas were having regional gatherings for youth. And I just assumed everybody in Disciples believed as we seemed to believe in that congregation, only to find out that there was beginning a rather bitter fight within the Disciples of Christ regarding a number of issues, most of them social issues, but some of them were related biblically in terms of many people felt like the church was getting too far away from their intent of being a New Testament type church. And so there was a lot of discussion, let's put it that way. But what I realized is, I went to Phillips University when it was in Enid, and to the graduate seminary when it was also in Enid. My first church that had my ministerial license in 1972. The first church that I worked at was a United Methodist church. And that felt more comfortable to me coming out of the particular congregation that I had been a part of. The second church that I went to was a disciples church on its way to becoming an independent Christian church in southern Kansas. And they loved me. I couldn't stay with them. I was there for 15 months and it was 14 too long. And immediately after I moved to another church, they voted to become an independent congregation. And I had seen that coming and there wasn't anything I could do about it. In serving churches, disciples churches, in Arkansas and Kansas and Nebraska, I realized there was an incredibly wide gamut of opinions and diversity regarding a lot of social issues. I would like to say that it's split among urban and rural lines or some other kind of line, but I can't really say how that is. Some congregations that I pastored, you could not take communion unless you had been immersed. You could not become a member unless you were immersed, even if you had been baptized in another form at an earlier date. Other congregations were very open. They accepted whatever form of baptism you had, and they allowed a wide latitude for folks taking communion. So there was just an immense variety, is the best way to say it. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is likely evident in the lack of information in the About Us section. He's touching on that right now. You have the highlights here. Disciples grew out of the American frontier. It's American Protestantism by some former Presbyterian ministers. And they intentionally did not set out to form another denomination. They were against denominations. They thought that it was pointless to have denominations. The only thing that really mattered is that we were together and we were following Christ. That's the only distinction. That's why you'll see no creed but Christ. That is our thing. Because the founders actively said, you don't have to repeat words. The only thing you have to do is love Christ. And that's it. So in reality, it's like the founders of this denomination were the first ecumenical leaders of the time, because they were very much saying what those of us in the ecumenical world talk about as being we're more alike than we are different, and we should come together and be together. However, then what happens is we eventually became a denomination, and that was happening in 1968, and that's what we're referencing here, that a lot of churches at that point weren't happy because that wasn't what the church was founded to do. It was founded to be the New Testament church without all these boundaries. And so a lot of churches left when we officially became a denomination. A lot of churches left again in, and I forget the year, I could Google it, but in the early 2000s, the Disciples of Christ did make a national statement at our General Assembly that all people, regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, any factor, are welcome at the Lord's table. We lost a lot of congregations when that happened too, right? Because we did actively take the stand that, no, we're putting it on paper that everybody is welcome here. Everybody comes to the Lord's table. There's nothing to keep anybody away. You don't have to be disciples. You don't have to be baptized. You just have to come, right? So that's a good introduction. Sure. Yeah.
I will just also say thank you for that. And when I went to Ada in 2000, and I was there 8 years, my job was a campus minister. I was the director of an ecumenical campus ministry that the Methodist had started, and it had been called the Wesley Foundation. They were the ones that owned the property, but in the 70s, it became a United Campus Ministry, and so part of that was that the First Christian Church in town helped support that ministry. So I got to preach there a lot and actually worshiped there a lot, and had quite a few students who were there who took part in the ministry as well. One difference I will point out before we get into specific questions is that we have talked about that there are very few UCC churches in Oklahoma, but there are quite a few Christian churches. Do you know how many roughly there are in Oklahoma?
Yeah, I want to say there's a little over 100
Okay.
right
so-
now. I should know the exact number, but I don't.
Okay. Well, but that, Rita?
151.
So there's probably quite a few in Tulsa and Oklahoma City. We've got, 77 counties. We've got roughly 500 plus Methodist churches, 151 Christian churches. So actually, then quite a few more than the UCC. I will also just point out before we open it up for questions that in this bottom paragraph I wrote, or I didn't write, I just copied and pasted, that the slogan has sort of been in essentials, unity, and non-essentials, liberty, and all things charity, which is a slogan that other groups adopt as well, but that is
Right.
one that's sort of known to kind of float around the disciples. Is that correct?
I think you know that if you went to seminary and you
Yes.
had disciples polity. I don't think regular disciples do that.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
The other thing is the two essentials seem to be like the acceptance of Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, and then the obedience to him in baptism. Would you say those are kind of two biggies that sort of
Yep. Lord's
identify?
Supper and baptism
Okay.
are the biggies.
Okay. So I know I've got questions, but I'll go ahead and let you guys start. And there's a microphone right up here if you'll come to that mic. Do you have any questions about the disciples? I told them you would have a few. Come on, Jenny, to the microphone, because people at home can't hear if you're... And be sure that the mic is online, Jeff, okay?
I'm curious if when you were preaching at the Disciples Church, did you preside over communion? I meant you.
No.
Well,
Because
so
you're
me?
not a disciples pastor.
Well, so I will tell you my experience, and they can answer the question. I'm very well aware that I think that the pastor has a role, but I also know that there's... Do you have elders and
We have
deacons
elders and
that are
deacons,
laity,
yes.
right? But okay, so one difference between us would be that we don't have elders or deacons that are people in the pews. Our elders and deacons are considered clergy. My experience has been that sometimes there's two people that will offer a prayer, and one will, they may have a devotional thought, and then there's a prayer over the bread, a prayer over the cup, and then it might be done a little differently depending on your church, but that seems to be. Now, when I preached, I do believe that I did that, well aware that their understanding might be different, and it may have been that they didn't have people necessarily that were there that day to do it, or they were fine with me doing it. I didn't really ask, like, well, this isn't how you normally do it. I do think that sometimes the pastor plays a role. Is that correct? Or do you want to explain how communion traditionally is done in a disciples?
Well, and that's another thing that varies from church
Yes.
to church. Do you
Yes.
want to?
Well, and that's something that we really did not learn very well in seminary. And so one of the this first church that I was telling you about, I did not preside over communion. They had elders that did communion, and my job was to take communion. And that was it. I mean, I preached, but I did not preside over communion. And yet the next congregation that I went to, none of them ever did communion. They might say a prayer, but mostly they just stood there and looked nice is the only way that I know to describe it.
So,
Now, and in the church where I grew up, it was more like this first one where the elders presided over communion and the pastor was part of it, but tangentially. So,
Yeah, every church does it differently, and I've experienced it differently in a lot of different places. The key theological factor, I think, to take from it is that disciples believe that communion is of the people. Communion is a gift of God, and any person can touch, any person can preside, any person can bless. Any person.
as far as the way you receive, is it all over the board as well? I know when I would go with my grandparents' church, we sat in the pews and the plates were passed. Is that the traditional way of doing it? And do you see churches doing it in a variety of ways now, or?
Yeah, there's definitely a variety. The last church I was at had 2 services, and at one service you came down and did intinction, In the next service, the trays were passed in the exact same church. So, I mean, it can be whatever you want it to be. You can pass the trays, you can come up and take it from the trays, or you can do intinction. You can do whatever makes sense for you and that you connect best with. There's really we don't have a book of discipline. That's the biggest thing. Like, disciples do not have a book of discipline. There's not a specific liturgy that has to be read, none of that. So really, when you're presiding at the table, you're speaking, like when I would give the devotion, I would latch on to whatever my senior pastor had said in the sermon and make a little thought out of it that would go with communion. And I would have 2 elders with me. In addition, elders have presided, just like you said, and the pastor will just sit there and be served.
And I would say in the Methodist Church, for those who don't know this, primarily we sort of say, like, ordained elders, unless there's other circumstances where somebody else might be able to do it, preside. And we primarily say that because we sort of want to keep the tradition. Paul, what am I trying to say? We don't want people just saying whatever and doing whatever, and saying like, well, today I feel like we should all have pizza and Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
So there's sort of a sense in which they're kind of guarding, if you will, the tradition, right? And although we would let anybody help serve, right? But in terms of who's kind of overseeing it, we sort of say, well, the ordained clergy oversee it, right?
And part of that is understanding Holy Communion as a sacrament. In disciples, it would not be considered a sacrament. Some of the congregations used the word ordinances, but basically it was common practice would be a better way to say it. But and it was also in some senses true for baptism. While the pastor may be the one that typically baptizes, there's not anything that says an elder couldn't baptize or another lay person couldn't baptize someone within their family. That kind of gets worked out on a moment-by-moment basis. And sometimes in congregations, they were so happy to have a baptism, they'd have 6 or 7 people in the baptistry and baptizing along with them. So I mean, it really is kind of all over the place. Huh? Yeah, but so there is a wide variety of differences. One of the things that Shannon talked about was the General Assembly, where we have our General Conference, which speaks for the United Methodist Church. The General Assembly, we would probably describe it best as a cooperative assembly. It's not binding upon any congregation, but it does make statements that they believe fit the collective will of most congregations. Yep. And so it doesn't have the rule of law as statements from our General Conference would. The other really big thing that I was aware of is the size and the breadth of the United Methodist connection compared with Disciples. Disciples is largely a North American denomination. I'm sure there are some in other countries, but there are not a great many by comparison.
Well, one of the things that the UCC, I think, was that they don't really plant churches outside the U.S., but they would partner with organizations. Is that the same kind of for the disciples?
Yeah, I know there's a lot of international partnerships. We have an Office of Global Ministries that manages and functions with that so that we are being effective globally. We do try and be mindful of the ways in which we do that and engage in that. We have a, it's called the Week of Compassion. It's like what would you call that?
Be similar to our United Methodist Committee on Relief, or
Yeah.
those kinds of things. It is designed for helping in areas around the world.
Yes,
So.
and they're very active, do a lot of work, still to this day, helping keep Bosnia going.
Keep what?
Bosnia, and that war was, 30 years ago? So, I mean, it's an active, ongoing ministry that happens at the national level. And Paul mentioned baptism, and I think I came up with a quippy good way to describe this theologically for you all. You all have infant baptism, later confirmation, right?
Yes.
Just flip them. In disciples, when they're a baby, their parents bring them forward to dedicate them, right? And so the parent makes public promises that we're going to raise this child in the way of God. The church makes promises that they're going to be there for this child as they grow and learn in the way of God. And then when that child reaches an age, they decide, I'm ready to be baptized. And normally that comes with a pastor's class that helps educate them on the meaning of that decision. So really, theologically, if you just flip those two, that's exactly how the disciples are, in that we don't baptize as a baby, but we dedicate them.
What about when somebody wants to transfer from another denomination?
You do not have to be rebaptized.
Okay.
No rebaptism. Now that clearly existed.
That changed.
Yeah.
I mean, that was one of the changes that
Yeah.
was coming, so.
Yeah, that did exist.
Yeah.
So if
It
somebody
does
wasn't
not.
immersed, they would be seen as equally baptized?
Yes,
Yeah.
100%. If you were sprinkled as a baby, you're fine. You're good. You don't have to do it again.
What if somebody said, well, I want to experience immersion?
I would say, okay, I would be glad to dunk you in the neighborhood pool,
Yeah.
and you can feel what that feels like. When I was in seminary, they had a thing called Stole Camp, where we would go and learn these practical movements of ministry that they don't teach you in seminary. And so they had us literally learning how to dunk human beings into water, which is a very interesting and funny experience.
Come up, Anna Faye.
I was just curious, you said baptism is not a sacrament?
There are no
Yeah,
sacraments.
disciples and sacrament, no. That's not our language. I think you've recently talked about Episcopalians and Lutherans. They are what we would call very high church, high liturgy, robes, stoles, the whole thing. You know what I'm talking about? Like very high church. Disciples are more low church, less pomp and circumstance, I guess. We would shy away from words like sacraments. That sounds very heavy and scary and Catholic.
However, you guys are in conversation with other denominations. I mean, you
Oh,
guys
yeah.
and you guys work with other denominations, as opposed to some churches that would not work with other denominations.
No, yeah.
Yeah.
Disciples have always historically been at the forefront of ecumenical and interfaith dialogue. So that's
And
definitely.
yes, and the more conservative groups which left drew further away from that
Yeah.
ecumenical kind of understanding.
Yep. As far as property, you mentioned that. Churches do own their property, which also makes them financially responsible fully for their property. However, there are churches within specifically the Oklahoma region that I know of that have entered into agreements with our regional church, which is like our conference, that if for some reason the church has to sell the building, it has to go back to the region, like proceeds go to the regional church. So there are agreements like that out there. I don't know how many of those there are because I'm not in on all those developments, but I do know that we had one close recently where that was a part of the dialogue, was that, you know, the equity of that building was designated for the disciples in Oklahoma.
What about calling? How do you get a pastor? How does a pastor
Yeah.
find a church?
Yeah, currently now there is a digital system. It's called Search and Call. And the way it works is if I'm looking to see what's out there and I feel called to go somewhere different, then I will go into this Search and Call system and fill out a massive profile. It is the longest booger. It takes forever. So you really have to be motivated to like want to do this, to engage in this process. What was it like before
Well,
it
it
was
was
In the old days, Paul.
In the
Tell
old
me.
days.
Because
in
it's a
the old
nightmare
days.
now.
Well, it was a nightmare then. It was just paper.
Yeah.
And when I was first starting out, the time lapse between pastorates was fairly brief. But in the middle 80s, when I quit doing that, we would make our applications and they would go out to the various regional offices and district offices, and we would get letters that would say the average placement time could be anywhere between 1 and 6 years before you would be located into a new church. I don't know if
It's probably
that's,
about the same. It's
Okay.
worse if you're a woman.
yeah.
It's going to be more like 6 years.
Okay.
But in the digital system, and why this matters is as a church, if you were looking for a new pastor,
Right.
you get to fill out one too. Yay! So
And-
there are, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
There are ministerial profiles and there are church profiles. So they both exist. And then what I say as a candidate is, I am willing to move to these places. Like I'll move to Kansas, I'll move to California, I'll move to, the East Coast. And I designate where I want my profile to go. And then the local regional offices will see in their system, these are the candidates willing to come here, and here are our church profiles. And it's up to the regional staff, the regional ministers, to be familiar enough with the churches looking that they can look at a ministerial profile and see that there's a potential match. Some regional ministers will just send every ministerial profile to every church that's looking, and, why not? Let them see all of them. And then you as a church would look at the profiles and say, these are the ones we'd like to talk to. And then you start interviewing. Usually churches form a search committee of members in the church that's as diverse as possible. And that's the group that does it, and it's hard work. But the church actively works to choose and call their own minister. And ministers actively work and choose. I mean, it's a mutual choice. So,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry? Who pays the pastor? Like to bring a pastor in, you'll have to budget for that. And what I can honestly say is what a lot of churches do right now is they do phone calls and Zoom until they're ready to say, we need to meet this person live. Like, we need to bring that person here. And usually a church will only bring in 1 or 2 people, because you've done so much talking to them leading up till then. So it's just something to be aware of in the process that, You might have to fly in a candidate that you love and put them up in a hotel room if they have a spouse or a partner to bring, right? Like, and taking them out to dinner, showing them the city if they're not from here. It's like courting. You're dating. It really is. That's what it's like.
Even though Methodists don't do it that way, there are times when you go to a town and the church will pay for you to come, and some churches never offer to pay in the Methodist system.
Yes,
So that's happened to me, you know. Mary Ann, did that answer your question?
Yeah,
Anna Faye?
did that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mary Ann, what's your question?
I see that, well, I don't see, I guess, LGBTQ.
Yep.
It's left to the local congregation, is that, am I understanding that correctly?
Yes.
So if in a disciples church, if a gay couple wanted to get married, the pastor wanted to do it, that's no problem. If you wanted to call a gay pastor, that's okay, there's no problem.
100% okay.
But is that just in theory, like it takes the woman longer to find the job? I mean, realistically, is a gay pastor going to get called to go somewhere?
It's happened.
Has it?
Yes.
She doesn't believe it. She's seen it.
No,
Okay.
I have seen it. It's real.
Okay.
It's happened.
Okay, and so the weddings and all that stuff, that's all done as well? It just happens, there's no, so
Yeah.
it really is an affirming congregation if it says it's an affirming congregation?
100%.
And the denomination just stays out of it?
That's right.
Is that right?
Now, let me assure you, though, that at the national level denomination, they are pro-LGBTQ+. So you will never in a million years have the national denomination or the local denomination upset, because that's the side we err on,
Okay.
is pro-LGBTQ, and have said that at the national level. But we are congregational, so the congregation calls the shots. So you can call whoever you want. But yeah, I have witnessed multiple people from the LGBTQ community be called as pastors to local churches. It has and does happen.
One of the things that Lori Waukee and Lisa Wolf told us in the UCC was if a local church hired somebody that wasn't on their approved list, you know, they can't tell them not to do that, but they say you're on your own, we don't cover you legally anymore.
Right.
So
That's
do you
right.
have that same kind of thing?
Same thing. If a disciples church decides to hire someone who does not have standing as a disciple minister, you can, but you're on your own. Like, the region has certain legal coverage that throws an umbrella over churches in certain circumstances. But if you go rogue and you hire someone who it does not have recognized standing, I'm not going to say ordained DOC,
Right.
because we have relationships with others, but if you don't have DOC standing then it's the same.
I also want to ask, a Methodist have what we call apportionments, which is how we support not only administration up above us, you know, the district, the annual conference, even the global church, but then missions. You mentioned regional staff. So how do you fund like your regional staff? And what about, how do you fund things like camps or, and what other kinds of ministries do you guys have? That's a big question, but.
Yeah. Do you want?
Go ahead, and then I'll.
Okay.
I'll
Okay, so the disciples have 4 special offerings throughout the year. And they happen on different Sundays. They're established in advance. And all it is a special envelope that goes in your bulletin. And so you would still give what you normally give to your church home, but then you can also give to this special offering. And each special offering goes to fund a specific part of the denominational and regional work. So there is a DMF offering coming up. That's the Disciples Mission Fund, and that's a national level ministry. So when you go to church, you give, and then you can put some money into that envelope for the special DMF offering, and the regional church will send that up to the general church. Now, each region gets a particular percentage from the national DMF fund based on how large the region is. Okay? So if you're a region with 151 churches, you're going to get more percentage of those dollars than a region with 4. Right? So that goes to help fund the local general operations. One of those special offerings is just for the local region. So that's 4 times a year that you're doing a special offering to support general ministries and local administration. As far as camp goes, we do have camp for children and youth. I grew up going, and that campsite is still in existence, if you can believe it. So the way that works is most churches have an account set up where they will pay half of a child's tuition to go to camp. There are also many scholarships at the local Oklahoma level that help cover camp costs for kids and help run the camp. The disciples do not own any camps. I think the Methodists own some campsites. The disciples do not own them. Therefore, the disciples are not fully financially invested in running and functioning a full campsite. So really, when it comes time for camp, we're paying to send our kids.
And when those camps are established, they may ask local congregations if they want to help raise the money to institute this camp or to run specific programs or expand the ministries of the camp.
So it was more than just camps. I was wondering, like, we have like Oklahoma City University.
Right.
We have Skyline here in the city. What kind of ministries do you do? Ministries together like that are also supported? How do they get their support? Or
United Disciples Ministries across the state. No, there's not a lot of that.
Okay.
And that goes back to there's not a lot of information in the About Us section, and the diversity of theologies that exist.
Yes.
I can see your wheels turning.
Okay, well this is why I'm United Methodist. Because I heard a sermon in a United Methodist congregation about apportionments. And I walked out saying, my God, that's the most wonderful thing I have ever heard of in my life. And I started the process to transfer my orders to the United Methodist Church, because that just the concept to me of people making a covenant with each other to support these, even the ones they don't really care anything about, but they make. I mean, that's why I became a United Methodist, because I was very frustrated with disciples' ability to fund things that were very important.
So how is like Phillips Seminary funded then, or how do they exist, or
Endowments.
Endowments,
Yes.
okay.
They've got hefty endowments, and still donor dollars. They still run donor campaigns. They're running one now. If they haven't called you, they will.
Yes, they have.
They're very diligent about those phone calls. So they have, when they sold the campus in Enid, there was some hefty endowment money that helped continue the seminary.
Okay.
Now, there are many disciples' colleges and universities out there. The most popular being Texas Christian University, TCU. Horned Frogs is a disciples. I see a thumbs up. Yep. And the frog thing that I can't do. Is this it? All right. See, is that it? That's it. All right. There you go. So Horned Frogs Disciples University. But I mean, it runs, the disciples denomination don't financially hold them.
Even with Oklahoma City University, we give a very small portion of their budget, and ours primarily goes to scholarships. It's not going to the operating fund and whatnot. But we do give a significant amount of money,
See, I didn't know what apportionments were until about a year and a half ago.
A portion meant for others.
Got it.
Kay,
I had the impression a number of years ago when I was associating with several women who were members of the Disciples of Christ, and some of them were ordained. And it was my understanding then that they often had difficulty finding charges to serve.
Yes.
And so my question is, what about women pastors in the church, and how are they received?
You can answer this one.
Yeah.
we are online also. I should have warned you
I
about
know.
that.
See, I'm seeing myself
Do I
on the
need to- do I
screen,
need to
and I'm like, oh.
do I need to pause it? Do I need to
No,
pause it?
because the real
Yeah.
story is it
Yes.
is hard for women.
Yes.
Even in the year 2021.
Even in the Methodist Church.
Yeah,
Yes.
it is a struggle. And what you see then often in women ministers is women end up in seminary knowing that the barriers ahead of them could crush them. So often the women who end up in ministry out of seminary are some of the most driven, passionate servants that could ever exist on this planet, because they went in knowing, I'm not going to be handed authority. I'm not going to be handed a job. I'm not going to be handed anything. I'm going to be actively discriminated against, actually. And that is the reality, is that there is active discrimination against women. I don't think that is just a disciples thing, as Scott has said. I will say that the itinerant system benefits women in that the church can't exclude them. I served a church, I'm not going to name it here because we're online. And I was the associate. I was the very first woman on staff at that church as an associate. It was one of those situations where I was there 16 months and it was 15 months too long. They were searching for a pastor, a senior pastor, while I was there as the associate, and they were actively saying in their search and call sessions, we're not going to even look at a woman. And they had a woman on staff.
Yeah. As
So-
you sit in this meeting and listen to the,
Yeah, and so that's actively happening. When I lived in Arkansas, there was a church that went without a pastor for 3.5 years because they refused to look at women. It's an active issue. And it's honestly going to take a lot to move past it, and a lot of really loud, great allyship from our male brothers.
Yeah, I've told this story before, but in one church I was serving, they had a female pastor, not immediately before me, but pretty much right before me. And then as I was leaving, they were being told they were going to get a female pastor. And one of the comments that was made in an official meeting was, well, we had a female pastor and tried that. It didn't work out so great, although she had been there 5 years, I think. And if I had been thinking quick enough and had been a better ally, over the time I'd been there, I had heard them sort of complain about more than one of the male pastors they had had in the past 20 years. And I wish I had just thought to say, that may be true that you perhaps did not like her, but that's you, that's not the whole church, or there may have been some problems. That's true of any pastor.
Yeah.
Yes. And, but I wish I had thought quick enough to say, well, what about all the male pastors that you've kind of privately told me you didn't like? But you're gonna try another male pastor though. But
Right,
like you
right.
would never say, well, we had a male pastor we didn't like. You know,
Yeah.
we tried that.
We
But-
tried a man, and it just didn't work.
I just didn't think quick enough to say that, you know.
That's what
I would say that even in our denomination,
Yeah.
people can get sent to a church, but the church can sort of make life miserable for
Oh.
you. And the pastor sort of says, can I stay here a year? Can I stay here 2 years? You know. And I also think their study just came out about the Methodist but the pay's not equal.
No.
no.
And so even though we also tend to make jokes about, the token people, where we have a female on the cabinet, for example. Well, that doesn't mean anything. If 8 female were better than 8 male, let's have 8 female. It's not a matter of, well, we already have 1 female, right? Those comments are just
Right.
horrible, but we tend to still hear those comments.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So we still have a long ways to go.
Yeah, I think women make 75 cents on the dollar.
In the church or just
In the
across the board?
church,
Yeah, in the
which is
church.
worse than in secular society.
Wow.
That's a bigger pay discrepancy in churches
Mm-hmm.
than in secular society. The pay gap is even
Well,
worse.
and I
And I
think,
see Rita.
go ahead, Rita.
I just wanted one of the speakers to tell us about the first woman that was ordained as a disciple.
Who was the first woman ordained as a disciple?
Oh my gosh, I wrote a paper about her and I don't remember her name. Rita. Clara Babcock.
Yeah.
You're going to have to tell it, Rita.
Come to the
Here's
mic. Come to the mic.
Tell us this.
Bring it on. That's been a minute.
Well, I think this is an important story.
Yes,
Yes.
please.
A lot about what we're just talking about.
Yes.
Stand pretty close to the mic so we can hear you, okay?
There are several ways to look about women's participation in our church. When it was first forming, I'm not sure disciples would have made it if it hadn't been for the women, because they really did encourage and push and raise money for the missions.
Were
And
you a disciple, Rita? Are you a disciple?
Yes.
Oh, yay.
And in fact, a few years later, after the disciples started getting stronger, they realized it was the women who had raised the money, and they took the money away from them.
Yes.
And that's how the disciples got started. That was one thread. That's not the whole. I
Yeah.
don't mean to say that was the way it happened, but during that period, they discovered that people who were in the mission of the church could have free transportation on the train if they could identify themselves as ordained. And so the disciples started ordaining women, and Clara Babcock was the first one to get that.
Okay.
Now, in a way, that was something, but the point of the story now is that our church never theologically discussed the role of the woman. It was a matter of saving money for a train ride.
Oh, my. Wow.
I do think, what's the big disciples church in D.C.?
National City Christian
Isn't it
Church.
pastored by Amy Butler?
Yes, she's
Yeah.
the interim
Yeah.
right now.
The interim, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
although they should probably
call
just
her.
hire her, but that's my own opinion. Yeah, National City Christian Church is the big banner church of the disciples in DC, and it's stunning and beautiful. And Amy Butler, who was at Riverside, is currently there.
So we are about out of time. Does anybody have a really urgent question or comment to make? Okay. Do you have anything you want to sort of just say to wrap up, or do you feel like you've covered it all? Or I wanted to just ask, because we asked Lisa and Lori about this.
Yeah.
You do have some kind of an agreement with the United Church of
Yes.
Christ. How does that sort of impact you? And I know you're working outside the local church,
Right.
but how does that impact people in the local church?
Well, essentially, I have what's called dual standing, and that means that I have standing with the disciples of Christ, but I also did the seminary requirements to have recognition through the UCC. So if I wanted to enter search and call, I could do so in both systems. So I could do search for a DOC church and search for a UCC church to serve. Now, obviously, if I served a UCC church, I probably wouldn't be in Oklahoma anymore because there aren't very many. But it does, because the theologies are so similar, the histories are so similar, and our relationship is so close that you can have both. But you do have to study the UCC stuff while you're in seminary as well to be able to do that. Did you do?
I did not.
You did
no,
not
they
do that.
they were just beginning the process of the talks.
Gotcha.
That was a long time ago.
Paul was in the dark ages.
I was, yes. I'm still
He
in
is
the dark.
pre-1980.
Yes,
I am
yeah.
post-1980.
There you go.
Yes.
Well, thank you both so much for being willing to share with us.
Of
I think it's
course.
been very helpful.
Yes. Yes.
Anna Faye, what's our closing song? And we can move out of the way so we're just not looking at everybody. So let's sing Hymn I Promise 707. Just a couple of announcements. We are going, well, Sunday morning, we're going to have a hamburger cookout right after worship. We'll be outside. You don't need to bring anything. It is Dorothy Carey's birthday coming up. If you want to bring a card for her, that would be great. At 4 o'clock is the Pride Parade, and instead of being in the parade this year, we're just going to be on the sidelines somewhere, and I'm going to go scope out a spot where it's hopefully shady, and I'll let everybody know by Sunday morning where that spot will be. So if you want to gather and then cheer on the people in the parade, we'll have our church banner, and so I'd like to encourage you to do that. And and next week for Space for Grace, we're going to return back to our normal sort of worshipful time without 55-minute long lectures and Q&A sessions. And I'm also hoping to spread the news that if anyone's sort of uncomfortable in coming on a Sunday morning, because we do have a lot more people on Sunday morning, that you can see we've got a lot more space on Wednesday nights to sort of spread out. So I hope that some people who perhaps haven't come on Sunday morning might want to come on Wednesday night. A lot of our folks are working with immunocompromised people, or they are compromised themselves, or they're just feeling really exposed during the week at work. And on Sunday mornings, I get it, they don't want to come, and that makes sense. And so let's be really gracious with each other during this time of COVID, right? So have a great week, and choir, we'll turn it over to you now. Thanks.